Rain hammered the shingles of Hollowmere Farm the night an old man in a beggar's coat knocked 3 times at the kitchen door, and the woman who answered it looked him over once, top to bottom, mud to matted beard, and told him plainly that this was not a house for charity, and if this story moves you, stay until the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight. Because what that woman did not know as she shut the door against the storm was that the old man she turned away owned every acre of land beneath her own feet. Not until it had already cost her everything she thought she was protecting. Josephine Hartley had not always been a woman who turned strangers from her door. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Hollowmere Farm belonged wholly to her late husband's family, and when kindness cost nothing because the harvest was good and the debts were few. But 3 years of failed crops and a husband buried too young had taught her a harder arithmetic, one in which every loaf of bread given away was a loaf her own children would not eat, and every act of charity was a luxury she could no longer afford to indulge. She managed the farm now with her 2 children, Thomas, 12, all elbows and stubbornness, and little Anne, 6, who still asked some nights when her father was coming home, and Josephine answered that question the only way she knew how, by working from before dawn until well after dark, by mending fences with her own hands, by learning the price of every seed and every nail so that nothing, absolutely nothing, could slip past her without her noticing the cost of it. She had grown in those 3 hard years, a shell around herself that the neighboring farms had come to know well, a woman polite enough in the marketplace, but closed as a fist the moment anyone asked anything of her that she could not immediately convert into profit, and she was not proud of the woman she had become on the nights when the guilt crept in uninvited, that a widow with 2 children could not afford the soft heart she had once carried so easily. The estate that bordered Hollowmere Farm belonged to the Duke of Ashcombe, a man none of the tenant families had laid eyes on in over a decade, for he managed his lands through a steward named Gideon Pratt, a thin, sharp-eyed man who collected rents with a punctuality that bordered on cruelty, begun hinting that Hollowmere's debts to the estate were growing too large to be indefinitely tolerated. Josephine had heard whispers in the village that the old duke, a man called Rowan Ashcombe, had grown strange and reclusive in his final years, that he had taken to wandering, that his mind was not entirely his own any more, and that his son, the current duke, a younger man named Edric, had all but abandoned the family seat to live in the capital, leaving the estate's affairs entirely in Pratt's capable and merciless hands. None of this seemed to Josephine like information that mattered to her particular troubles, and she filed it away, the way she filed away most gossip that did not directly threaten her ledger, which is to say, she forgot it almost as soon as she heard it, and she certainly did not think of it again on the night the ragged old man knocked at her door. He had come up the muddy lane in the worst of the storm, no coat to speak of beyond a threadbare cloak, soaked through and clinging to his thin shoulders, his white hair plastered flat against a face lined deep with age and exhaustion, and when Josephine opened the door a crack against the wind, she saw at once a man who looked as though he had walked a very long way with very little food in his belly. "Please," he said, and his voice was cultured beneath the exhaustion, a fact she noted and dismissed just as quickly, assuming a beggar might affect any manner of speech to win sympathy from a hard-hearted farm wife. "I have walked since morning, and I have nowhere to shelter tonight. I ask only for a corner of your barn and perhaps a crust of bread, and I will trouble you no further than that." Josephine looked at him a long moment, at the mud caked thick on his boots, at the trembling in his hands that might have been cold or might have been age, and she thought of the bread tin in her kitchen, already thinner than she liked. She thought of Thomas and Anne asleep upstairs, that a farm this close to ruin could not afford to feed every wandering stranger who came knocking in a storm. "I am sorry," she said, and she was, in some small buried corner of herself, sorry even as the words left her mouth. This is not a house that can spare charity, not this season. There is an inn 2 miles further along the road. Perhaps they will have room for you. The old man looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his tired eyes that she would only understand much later. Not anger, not even disappointment exactly, but a kind of weary recognition, as though he had expected precisely this answer. 2 miles, he repeated softly, in this weather. "I am sorry," she said again, and this time she closed the door before he could answer, and she stood with her back against the wood and listened to the rain hammer down outside, and told herself, as she had told herself so many times these last 3 years, that she had done what she had to do, that her children came first, that the world did not reward softness and she could not afford to pretend otherwise. She did not sleep well that night, though she told herself the storm alone was to blame for her restlessness, and she rose the next morning to find, near the edge of her property where the lane met the road, no sign of the old man at all, no footprints, no trace, only mud churned by the storm and the ordinary business of a farm waiting to be attended to. She might have forgotten the whole encounter entirely, filed it away with the 100 other small unkindnesses that survival had asked of her these last 3 years, had it not been for what happened 4 days later, when a rider in Ashcombe livery came galloping up the lane at a pace that suggested urgent business, and dismounted before her door with a grim, unreadable expression, and informed her that Gideon Pratt required her presence at the estate house that very afternoon, on a matter, the rider said, of considerable seriousness concerning the future of her tenancy. Josephine arrived at Ashcombe Hall with her stomach in knots, for she knew well enough what considerable seriousness concerning her tenancy generally meant among landowners with a steward as ruthless as Pratt, and she was shown into a study lined with dark oak shelves, where Pratt himself sat behind a heavy desk, thin fingers steepled, watching her enter with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting some while to deliver unwelcome news. "Mrs. Pend N. Hartley," he said, "I understand you have fallen 3 seasons behind on your rents, a fact I have been, I think, remarkably patient about, given the circumstances of your widowhood. However, patience has its limits, and I am afraid the estate can no longer extend the grace it has shown you. You have 30 days to produce the full sum owed, or Hollowmere Farm will revert to the estate's direct management, and you, your children, will be required to vacate." Josephine felt the floor tilt beneath her, for 30 days was nowhere near enough time to raise a sum that large, not with the harvest still weeks from ready, not with prices what they were, and she opened her mouth to argue, to plead, to do whatever might buy her children a little more time, when the study door opened without ceremony, and a man she did not recognize stepped inside, tall, well-dressed, with an authority in his bearing that made Pratt rise immediately from his chair, with an expression caught somewhere between deference and alarm. "Your Grace," Pratt said, and Josephine's heart stopped cold in her chest, for the man who had just entered the room was, impossibly, unmistakably, the ragged old beggar she had turned from her door 4 nights before, except now he wore fine dark wool instead of a soaked cloak, and his white hair was combed and dry. And the exhaustion that had bent his shoulders in the storm had been replaced by a straight-backed dignity that left no room for doubt about who he truly was. "I did not expect you at the Hall so soon," Pratt continued, recovering himself with visible effort. "I had understood you were travelling incognito, surveying the tenant farms yourself. A fine notion, your Grace, though I confess I worry for your health. wandering the countryside in such weather at your age?" "My health," said the old Duke, Rowan Ashcombe, for it was he, "is a good deal sturdier than my welcome, apparently, at certain doorsteps in this county." His eyes settled on Josephine, and she felt the full weight of recognition pass between them, felt her own face drain of colour as the truth of what she had done 4 nights ago crashed over her in full. For she had not merely turned away a beggar in a storm, she had turned away the Duke of Ashcombe himself, the very man whose steward now sat across the desk, threatening to strip her of her home. "You know this woman, your Grace?" Pratt asked, and there was something careful in his voice now, something calculating, as though he sensed an opportunity forming in the wreckage of Josephine's obvious terror. "I met Mrs. Hartley 4 nights ago," the Duke said, his eyes never leaving her face, "in the worst storm this county has seen in a decade, when I came to her door, soaked through, and asking for nothing more than a corner of her barn and a crust of bread." He paused, and the silence stretched long and terrible, and Josephine felt every second of it like a blade. "She turned me away." Pratt's expression shifted immediately into something eager, something predatory, and he leaned forward across the desk with the particular relish of a man who has just been handed a weapon he did not expect to receive. "Turned away? Your Grace himself in a storm without shelter or bread," he said. "Well, your Grace, I think that settles the matter of Hollowmere's tenancy rather more swiftly than I had anticipated. A woman who would show such callousness to a stranger at her door, let alone to the Duke himself, hardly seems deserving of further patience from this estate." "That is not," the Duke said, his voice suddenly sharp enough to cut through Pratt's eagerness entirely, "what I intended by mentioning it, Mr. Pratt, and I would ask you to remember precisely whose judgment governs this estate's affairs and whose does not." Pratt subsided at once, though Josephine noted the calculation did not leave his eyes so much as retreat temporarily behind a more careful expression, and she understood, with a cold clarity that settled somewhere beneath her ribs, that whatever happened next in this room, Pratt would find some way to use it against her, regardless of what the Duke himself decided. "Leave us, Mr. Plains." "Pratt," the Duke said, and though the steward hesitated, clearly unwilling to relinquish whatever advantage he believed he had just gained, he obeyed after a moment, closing the study door behind him with a soft click that nonetheless felt to Josephine like the closing of a trap. When they were alone, the Duke gestured to the chair across from his own, and waited until she had lowered herself into it, her hands twisted tight in her lap, before he spoke again. "I do not believe you knew who I was," he said, and it was not quite forgiveness in his voice. Not yet, but something more thoughtful than the anger she had braced herself for. "No," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I did not. I would not have turned away any man in that storm if I believed I could afford to feed him, your Grace. But I have 2 children upstairs, and a bread tin, thinner than I like to admit, and I have learned these last 3 years to weigh every kindness. I am not proud of what I have become. I did not used to be a woman who closed her door on a stranger in a storm." The Duke studied her a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened, though whether from sympathy or simple weariness, she could not yet tell. "I have walked this county for 11 days, he said, "disguised, as my steward apparently believes, as a wandering beggar, though the truth is rather simpler than that, I am afraid. I walk because my mind in recent years has grown less reliable than it once was, and there are days I forget entirely who I am and where I belong, and I wander until either my memory returns or someone takes pity on a confused old man. Most nights someone does. You are not the first to turn me away, Mrs. Hartley. though I confess the timing of our meeting, given what Pratt has just informed you regarding your tenancy, feels rather more consequential than most." Josephine felt something cold settle in her stomach at the implication in his words, and she asked carefully whether the timing of the rent notice and her encounter with him 4 nights prior were connected in some way she did not yet understand. "I do not yet know," he said, "though I intend to find out. And I would ask, Mrs. Hartley, that you tell no one of this conversation until I have had the chance to examine my steward's ledgers more closely than I have in some years. I have been, I am ashamed to admit, an absent landlord for too long, content to let Pratt manage affairs I ought to have overseen myself, and I begin to suspect that absence has cost more than my own peace of mind." He rose then, signalling the audience was at an end, and told her that her 30-day notice would be held in abeyance until he had completed his review. A mercy she accepted with a gratitude she could not fully voice, though she left Ashcombe Hall that afternoon with a knot of unease still lodged tight beneath her ribs. Uncertain whether she had just been spared or merely delayed towards some larger reckoning she could not yet see the shape of, the days that followed brought a strange, careful courtesy from the direction of Ashcombe Hall, for the Duke himself began appearing at Hollowmere Farm with a regularity that unsettled Josephine nearly as much as it intrigued her, arriving on foot, always modestly dressed, asking after her harvest, her children, the state of her fences and her stores, questions no landowner, in her experience, had ever troubled himself to ask a struggling tenant. Thomas took to the old Duke, almost immediately following him about the yard, with the particular hero worship of a boy who has missed a father's guidance more than he ever admits aloud. And Rowan Ashcombe, for his part, seemed to welcome the boy's company with a warmth that surprised Josephine each time she witnessed it. Teaching Thomas to identify which fence posts had rotted from within, explaining, with evident patience, the old methods of crop rotation his own father had taught him as a boy on this very land. Anne, shy at first, grew bold enough within a week to climb into his lap uninvited, while he sat resting on the porch steps, and the sight of the Duke of Ashcombe, with a 6-year-old girl asleep against his shoulder, was one Josephine found she could not easily reconcile with the cold, distant nobility she had always imagined ruling from behind Pratt's careful accounting.
"You did not have to keep coming here,"
she told him one afternoon in the 2nd week, as she handed him a cup of tea she could ill afford to spare, and he accepted with the same simple gratitude he had shown for a crust of bread he had never actually received. "I do not come out of obligation," he said. "I come because your children remind me of a life I lived once, before titles and ledgers took the whole of my attention, and because I find, Hartley, that I owe you a debt rather larger than a night's shelter, though it has taken me some days to understand its full shape." He told her then slowly, over the course of several visits, what his review of Pratt's ledgers had begun to reveal: discrepancies stretching back years, rents collected from tenant farms that never appeared in the estate's official accounts, small parcels of land held a controlling interest in, an elaborate scheme of slow, careful theft, conducted under cover of an absent duke's trust and a steward's practiced competence. "Your farm," he said, "along with 6 others in this county, has been deliberately allowed to fall behind on rents these past 2 years, not through any fault of your own management, but because Pratt has been quietly inflating the sums owed, skimming the difference before it ever reaches my accounts, and I believe he intended, all along, to seize Hollowmere and the others once the debts appeared unrecoverable, folding your lands into holdings he could then sell at considerable profit to himself." Josephine sat very still as this settled over her, the 3 years of increasingly impossible arithmetic suddenly reframed, not as her own failure, but as someone else's deliberate cruelty, and she felt something hot and furious rise in her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not since her husband's death had first taught her that anger was a luxury widow with 2 children could not afford. The confrontation, when it came, arrived faster than either of them expected, for Pratt, sensing, perhaps, that his careful scheme was beginning to unravel beneath the Duke's newly attentive eye, moved to secure his advantage before it could be taken from him entirely. He arrived at Hollowmere Farm on a grey morning with 2 hired men and a formal notice of eviction, informing Josephine that the 30-day grace period the Duke had promised had in fact expired according to the estate's official records Pratt himself controlled and had, Josephine now understood, likely falsified the moment he sensed his employer's growing suspicion. The Duke's word means little against a properly executed legal notice, Mrs. Hartley, Pratt said, standing in her yard with a satisfaction he did not bother to disguise. His Grace's memory, as I am sure you have noticed, is not what it once was, and I doubt very much a magistrate would credit the recollections of a man widely known throughout this county to wander confused and forgetful over the plain written record of his own steward's ledgers. Josephine felt fear claw up her throat at the casual cruelty of the implication that Pratt intended to use the Duke's failing memory itself as a weapon, painting Rowan Ashcombe as too unreliable to be believed, and she understood in that moment precisely how dangerous a man Pratt truly was, willing to sacrifice even his employer's dignity to protect his own theft. "You will not remove this family from their home?" came a voice from the lane, and Josephine turned to find the Duke himself approaching, his bearing sharper and more commanding than she had yet seen it, any trace of the wandering old beggar entirely absent from his stride. "I have reviewed your ledgers thoroughly these past 2 weeks, Mr. Pratt, and I have found what I believe to be clear evidence of fraud stretching back some 3 years, rents collected and never recorded, parcels of estate, land sold to a company in which you hold considerable private interest, debts inflated against tenants who have done nothing but work this land honestly." Pratt's composure cracked for the first time since Josephine had known him, a flicker of genuine alarm passing behind his sharp eyes before he mastered himself. "Your Grace's memory," he began carefully, "has been known to falter on occasion, and I wonder whether these accusations might not simply be a symptom of confusion rather than genuine discovery." "My memory," the Duke said, and his voice carried an icy precision that made even the hired men shift uneasily where they stood, "may falter on the small matters of a given afternoon, Mr. Pratt, but I assure you it remains entirely intact where sums of fraud and betrayal are concerned, and I have, in fact, brought a magistrate's clerk with me this very morning to review the same ledgers I have spent the past 2 weeks studying, along with sworn statements from 3 other tenant families whose accounts match precisely the pattern of theft I have uncovered in your own records." The magistrate's clerk, a quiet, precise young man who had been standing discreetly near the Duke's carriage, stepped forward now with a leather folder of documents, and the colour drained rapidly from Pratt's face as the clerk began methodically to lay out the evidence gathered over the preceding fortnight. Ledger entries that did not match the estate's official accounts, correspondence between Pratt and the holding company revealing his controlling interest, sworn statements from tenant families across the county describing the same slow, deliberate inflation of debts that had brought Hollowmere Farm to the brink of ruin. Pratt attempted for a few desperate minutes to argue that the discrepancies were merely clerical errors, that the correspondence had been misread, that tenant families eager to escape their legitimate debts might easily conspire to accuse an honest steward of wrongdoing he had never committed, but each excuse crumbled faster than the last beneath the weight of documentation the Duke had assembled, and by the time the clerk finished reading the final statement aloud, Even the two hired men Pratt had brought to enforce the eviction had begun edging quietly toward the lane, unwilling to remain associated with the scheme so thoroughly and publicly exposed. "You are dismissed from your position, effective immediately," the Duke said, "and I intend to pursue the fullest legal consequence available to me for the fraud you have perpetrated against this family and the 6 others you believe too powerless to ever uncover your theft. Mrs. Hartley's debts, along with those of every tenant family you have wronged these past 3 years, are forgiven in full, and any land improperly transferred to your holding company will be returned to this estate without delay." Pratt's face had gone the color of old ash, and he opened his mouth as though to argue further, but the magistrate's clerk stepped forward with a formal summons that silenced whatever protest he might have attempted, and within the hour he was escorted from Hollowmere Farm entirely, his career and his freedom both hanging now on a reckoning. He had spent years believing he would never face. Josephine stood in her own yard, watching the carriage that carried Pratt away disappear down the muddy lane, and felt a relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees beneath her. 3 years of crushing, unexplainable debt suddenly revealed as someone else's deliberate theft. 3 years of guilt over her own perceived failures as a farmer and a widow, lifted away in the span of a single devastating morning. The weeks that followed brought a slow, careful unwinding of everything Pratt had built, for the magistrate's investigation soon widened to include the other tenant families the Duke had named, each of them coming forward in turn with their own accounts of inflated debts and quiet threats, each testimony adding weight to a case that grew, by the time it reached formal hearing, into one of the most thoroughly documented frauds the county's court had seen in a generation. Josephine testified alongside the others, describing not only the financial ruin Pratt's scheme had nearly visited upon her family, but also the particular cruelty of his attempt to use the Duke's own failing memory as a weapon against an old man who had, whatever his lapses, never once forgotten the fundamental decency owed to the people whose labor sustained his estate. The court found Pratt guilty on every count brought against him, and the sentence handed down stripped him of both his freedom and whatever remained of his stolen fortune, the bulk of which was ordered returned to the tenant families he had so carefully and quietly wronged. In the months that followed the trial, Rowan Ashcombe began spending more of his remaining years at Hollowmere Farm than at the grand echoing halls of Ashcombe Estate, for he told Josephine on one quiet evening, as they sat together watching Thomas teach Anne to skip stones across the pond behind the barn, that he had not felt so entirely at peace in decades as he did in the company of a family who valued him for exactly what he could offer them in a given moment, rather than for the title he carried or the fortune attached to his name. "I did not blame you," he told her, "for turning me away that first night, though, I confess, it stung rather more than I expected it to at the time. You did not know me, and you were protecting what little you had left to protect, and I have come, in the months since, to understand that as its own kind of integrity, however painful it was for an old man to receive it in a storm." Josephine, for her part, found she had begun to soften in ways she had not thought possible, after 3 years of hardening herself against every possible cost, teaching her children again the small kindnesses she had once considered too expensive to afford, sharing bread with neighboring families who had fallen on hard times themselves, understanding now, in a way she had not fully grasped before, that the shell she had built around her own heart had cost her something nearly as valuable as the debts Pratt had stolen from her. Edric Ashcombe, the current Duke and Rowan's son, arrived from the capital some months later. Once word of the scandal reached him, and though Josephine had feared at first that the younger Duke might resent the attention his father had lavished upon a tenant family, She found instead a man deeply grateful that someone had finally exposed the fraud his own long absence had allowed to fester, and grateful too, in a quieter and more personal way, that his aging father had found in his final years a warmth and purpose he had not shown in decades of isolated grandeur. It was Edric, in fact, who suggested that Hollowmere Farm be granted not merely forgiveness of its debts, but outright ownership, a gesture Josephine tried at first to refuse as too generous, until old Rowan himself insisted, telling her plainly that a debt of gratitude once properly weighed, that he intended to see his own debt, to her repaid in full, before age finally claimed the last of his failing memory entirely. Rowan Ashcombe lived 3 more years after that storm-soaked night at Josephine's kitchen door. Years spent largely at Hollowmere Farm among the family, who had, however reluctantly at first, taken him in, and when he passed at last on a quiet autumn evening with Thomas and Anne both at his bedside, the whole county turned out for a funeral that filled the small stone church far beyond its ordinary capacity. Tenant families and noble houses alike come to honor a man who had spent his final years proving, in the plainest possible terms, that true worth had very little to do with the title stitched into a coat or the wealth, and a great deal to do with the simple, difficult choice to be kind even when kindness seemed, by every hard arithmetic of survival, entirely unaffordable. Josephine Hartley, who had once turned a ragged stranger from her door in the worst storm of the decade, spent the remainder of her own long life telling anyone who would listen that the greatest lesson of her widowhood had not been the harvest she eventually saved, or the debt she eventually cleared, but the plain, hard-won understanding that a door closed against a stranger in need could cost far more than any bread spared, and that the softness she had once believed she could no longer afford had turned out, in the end, to be the very thing that saved her family entirely.